Okay, so Transport for New South Wales does strategic transport planning and service coordination and delivery. So why is Transport for New South Wales interested in waste transport? So we're preparing a freight and ports plan, which is part of the Future Transport 2056 program, and also is integrated with the Greater Sydney Commission's work for land use planning. We're using the same population and employment forecasts, and there's also regional plans outside Sydney. We've collaborated with the EPA and have been given some input from the waste industry into this study. We've looked at Sydney, where the problems or issues are largest, while expecting similar issues will occur across New South Wales, although probably smaller in scale. What does the waste transport chain look like? Over to Richard.
Thanks, Kirk. So, I thought we'd just start with an overall model, one of the outputs from the project. Gives you a sense of the systems diagram that is the Sydney Basin waste flows for 16-17. We estimate about 10 million tonnes of waste is generated. That's based on 60% of the state population is in Sydney, and so that metric just scales down from the state numbers. We've got a breakdown there between CNI, MSW and CND, and then we track the fates and flows through. Now this was done at a point in time, it was the middle of last year, so it didn't have the MBT, Woodlawn. It certainly hasn't got the export impacts of China. That was nowhere on the horizon. It had been floated, but there was no clarity around that. So this is a fairly high level estimate. We haven't gone down into the fine details of recycling, organics and residual in this diagram. But it's worth, I thought, just getting that sense out there at the beginning. Just to talk a little bit behind the diagram and behind the project. CFNSW, as Kirk said, was keen to kind of have a granular understanding, granular is too strong, a detailed understanding of what the waste system and recycling system looks like, what it was going to look like in 2036 and 2056. So we've done a modelling exercise, strategic modelling to look at that going forward. Why are they looking at that? Congestion, waste intensity, urban development, and those issues resonated very strongly in the industry consultation that we did. We found that trips are certainly getting longer and slower as congestion is becoming an issue, that more waste is going through transfer stations than ever before, again given the length of trips. That mixed use precincts are becoming a challenge as we're getting residents now living in CBD Sydney and what used to be commercial areas with warehouse developments and what have you, which means that you can't, there's more pressure around the nighttime collection. It used to be you could even out the collection pattern by collecting the commercial waste at nighttime to some extent. There's not that simple, there's this pressure around that, harder to avoid the daytime peaks as a result. MUDs, with the increasing densification we've heard this morning, and we'll be hearing again later on that with the more high-rise towers, there's basement to be cleared, and as a result, with the design guidelines, you can't get your big compactor down there, so it's the little Garwood guys must be doing gangbusters because they're going underground, but that means there are more trucks on the road, smaller trucks running around, collecting smaller volumes. The other piece that was of concern to CMSW and I think to the waste industry coming through very strongly is the closure of landfill capacity within Sydney and the challenges of getting new ones up, and I don't think in fact anyone's really proposing a new landfill in Sydney. So we mapped all the waste facilities, landfill resource recovery, MRFs, all the way through from Wollongong to Newcastle, and with a view to then building that flow chart from local government area through to a particular facility, transfer station to an endpoint or a MRF, to try and give a sense of what was happening on the roads to TFNSW. To do that, we also had to look at the capacities and around landfill closure. So we have Lucas Heights scheduled to close in the mid-30s, 2030s. Woodlawn not too long in the mid-40s probably. And so there goes our Pute existing capacity. These are long lead time facilities, so how are we going to start planning for that? And where are we going to put these things, and how are we going to get the waste there? Again, is starting to come into the forefront of the mind for TFNSW. Non-Pute, there's a lot of new projects in the major projects register looking to recycle and process C&D waste. There's also a lot of landfill closures scheduled over the next 8 years. So from 2016 to 2024, there's about 2 million tonnes of non-Pute landfill capacity we think is scheduled to exit the market. So everything from Spring Farm in 2016 through to Kemps Creek, 2024. And while we made some assumptions around those capacities, they're based on some pretty good industry intelligence. So 2 million tonnes is leaving the market, non-Pute capacity, landfill. At the same time as we're getting 1 million tonnes coming back from Queensland, which is predominantly C&D waste, so it needs to find a home somewhere. So again, these issues are starting to coalesce into a particular challenge for Sydney in terms of moving its waste and where it goes to. So it's a strategic model, long term. So what we've done, the brief was to, at the LGA level, to look at what is the generation going on at each LGA. So that's MSW, it's CNI and C&D, and then project that forward. Okay, so what we've done here, this is a 2056 heat map. We did that by looking at CNI waste per employee as a state average, and then applying that to the number of employees within that LGA, using planning department data around the employment in that zone, and then projecting that forward. There's good visibility, good projections for the Department of Planning in that. For C&D and for MSW, we did that at residence. So that was the best correlation. So again, an MSW generation rate per capita and a C&D generation rate per capita, then applied to the number of residents within that LGA, and then projected forward. The blue is less than 500 tonnes per annum generated, all the way through the red, which is more than 5,000 tonnes generated. So that gave us a sense of the sources, and then the next step was to understand, okay, so where is it going? I said we mapped all the waste facilities that we could get our hands on, both published and unpublished EPA sources, the waste infrastructure strategy, had some draft lists out of different infrastructure types and facilities. We mined that. We did a pretty detailed, desktop review, aka Google search, to come up with as many facilities as we could. And then what we did is applied the proximity principle, not the Queensland one, but a principle that over 20 years, the most likely destination for waste coming from this LGA is to the closest appropriate facility. So while we all understand that the waste industry is far more complex than that, competitive drivers and councils might stipulate that over a 20-year span where you might get 3 iterations of a council contract, 15 iterations of a CNI contract, congestion is a major issue as we've talked about. We think it was a rational assumption to put it out that more often than not, the closest facility will be the facility that will receive the waste, the recycling, etc., maybe through a transfer station, and we've certainly allowed for that. So 10 million tonnes per annum, as said. We'll look in a minute at how that translates to traffic on the road. Just quickly on the growth assumptions, we've assumed 40% growth out to 2036. We built that model over a combination of per capita growth in generation and population growth. Our assumption around that, well, the population growth is just straight off the federal government, the New South Wales government forecasts. We assume that per capita growth is going to progressively slow and then flatline by 2036. This is debatable. It's how long is a piece of string, but I think it's a reasonably defensible one. We're looking at things such as light weighting of materials, and more of us living in muds, and therefore less consumption of goods as a result. Growing concern around environmental issues, and certainly the things we were hearing about this morning, circular economy, all that kind of language is starting to come through. So, we're less conservative than the EPA, which assumes that the war, and its war targets is shooting for zero growth in per capita by 2021. We think that's a bit ambitious, but that's what we've gone there. So the 2036 onwards is purely population growth with no increase in per capita generation. So how does that then translate onto the road network? So here's our daily waste trip calculator. Relatively simple table. So 10 million tonnes per annum as proposed. Most of it going through transfer stations. So this was the industry feedback that we got. Certainly C and D in particular going through that off to either then Queensland, aggregated to Queensland, or to some sort of processing and then to disposal. Bulked up at the transfer station, so different tonnage rates there. Again, in the C and D one, not the same sense of capacity to impact that. And the 12.5, it comes in skips, it comes in truck and dogs, it comes in all sorts of different sizes. So that's a bit of a weighted average based on some audits that we've done of C and D processing facilities. You work that through into a trips per annum and then trips per day, and we've got 6,400 loads of waste moving around Sydney and outside Sydney per day, with return trips 12,800. So it's a pretty significant number. It's got TFNSW's attention, and obviously that then is going to grow 40% over the next 20 years. In terms of how does that sit within the freight task within Sydney, TFNSW estimates that's something like 10% of the freight that gets moved around the Sydney Basin is waste and recyclables. It doesn't include materials off to reprocessors, but it does, and it does not include, I should add, the curbside collection piece. So or the residential roads where the major impacts are on the major arterials, the constraints and the impacts are on that. So it was too difficult to model the residential collection piece. It also wasn't strategically important for TFNSW to do so, so the constraints and the opportunities around those major arterial roads. So it's about 10% or thereabouts of the freight task, and growing, as I said, significantly, so that percentage may go up over time. I'll throw to Kirk to look at what that looks like then, actually on the road network.
Okay, so this is our morning peak. There's no surprise for anyone who drives around Sydney there. We have our major transfer stations to rail in some of the most heavily congested parts of the network. The other thing is the blue is trucks, all heavy vehicles, not just waste. So people who say don't let trucks run places during the peak hour are not going to solve the congestion problem. So that's the peak hour. If you look at the interpeak, we'll see that the trucks is already using the interpeak period where they can, and in some places, so Lucas Heights is here, and trucks are obviously very dominant there. The other point I make is that we already have we already have some industry trucks, including the waste industry, using the contra-peak direction where practical already. So I don't think there's great gains. So the morning peak, the busiest time is approximately 8 a.m. The truck peak is approximately 12:30 in the middle of the day. So what is New South Wales Government doing to address this? We've, the Future Transport 2056, identified a number of projects, but the context is in Western Sydney alone there's forecast to be 1 million extra people by 2056, with a high demand for construction materials, both residential and infrastructure and employment. So we've started planning for future capacity on the transport network, including for waste and recyclables. So we've got some major projects there. In particular, the outer Sydney, the blue line, the outer Sydney orbital, and this dark line here, the Western Sydney freight line, offer future options to move waste out of and around Sydney. At the moment, they're corridor protection projects, but by 2056, we hope to have, well before 2056, we hope to have those projects advanced to a construction stage. Where to from here? So the studies confirm that waste transport is a significant issue, but we've barely scratched the surface in terms of detail. The network, the information is going to be fed into our network analysis for transport planning, and we'll also support the EPA in their strategic planning. New South Wales Freight and Ports Plan will come out later this year. We have the transport corridor protections are open for comment until the 1st of June. So if you think those projects may be of interest, there's some brochures out the front here and they're accessible on the website. Also on the Transport for New South Wales website, you'll see our work on the future of road safety and heavy vehicle technology. There's a safety for heavy vehicle technology report that's downloadable, and Transport for New South Wales is looking forwards towards electronic work diaries and improved safety features for trucks. And that's our time. Thank you.